Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be explaining what utilitarianism is. More specifically, I will be explaining John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham's form of utilitarianism, which is the classical or hedonistic version of utilitarianism. According to Robert Bass, utilitarianism has 5 components. The first component is the nature of right action. Under utilitarianism, the nature of right action is the act that will have the best consequences, all things considered, of the options open to you. For example, if you have the option between saving 5 lives or 1 life, you ought to save 5 lives, since that will have a better consequence than the alternative action of saving just 1 life. The second component is about what actions are valuable. For utilitarianism, an action is valuable if it produces pleasure and bad if it produces pain. This explains why, for instance, it is good to tickle your little sister because it produces pleasure, but bad to torture her because it causes pain. As John Stuart Mill eloquently explained, quote, "The greatest happiness principle holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness." End quote. But what are happiness and unhappiness? Mill claims that happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain, and unhappiness is pain and the deprivation of pleasure. This characterization of happiness and unhappiness makes sense. If I am in the company of friends and family, I will experience pleasure and a lack of pain, since I enjoy spending time with them. By contrast, if I have an appointment at the dentist, I will experience the pain of having my teeth drilled to eliminate decayed tooth material, and thereby deprive myself of activities that would give me pleasure. The third component of utilitarianism is universability. This means that utilitarianism applies its principles to everyone regardless of their race, sex, nationality, or even species membership. Utilitarianism maintains that everyone's pleasure and pain must be taken into account when considering the rightness or wrongness of an action. For example, according to utilitarianism, the fact that an animal is not a member of the human species is not a good reason to ignore the interests of that animal, since he is still an individual that experiences pleasure and pain. The fourth component of utilitarianism is egalitarianism. Utilitarians apply their principles impartially or dispassionately. For example, the fact that someone is not a member of my family is no grounds for giving their pleasures and pains less importance than the pleasures and pains of members of my family. This is because familiar relations are not a morally relevant factor for utilitarianism. Only the consequences and the pleasures and pains of others matters when it comes to determining the morality of an action. Finally, utilitarianism is a maximization moral theory. This means that when one is considering the consequences of an action, the utilitarian does not merely want good consequences, but the best consequences. For example, consider 2 different environmental policies that will both do a good job at protecting the planet, but that one is just slightly better than the other. The utilitarian would claim that you are morally required to pick the environmental policy that is slightly better, since that act will produce the best consequences and more happiness than the alternative act of choosing the other policy. Utilitarianism is the view according to which the right action is the one that has the best consequences, all things considered, of the options open to you. Actions are valuable if they produce pleasure and the absence of pain, and bad if they cause pain and the deprivation of pleasure. Utilitarianism is a simple and intuitive moral theory. After all, it has a plausible account of what is valuable, happiness, and a satisfactory account of moral rightness, good consequences. Many of us value happiness for ourselves and other people, and we often act in ways to benefit others precisely because it will make them happy. For instance, I care about trying to see my grandma on the weekends since I know that will make her happy. Good consequences are something many of us value as well. This explains why, for example, we establish the rule of law for our country, since we need laws to bring about the good consequence of civilized life. Furthermore, as Robert Bass has pointed out, utilitarianism has an easily understandable method for answering questions about what is morally right and what is immoral. How do I know if performing this action is morally right or immoral? Consider the consequences and the pleasures and pain that this action will cause. For example, suppose I am wondering whether it is immoral to buy meat from the grocery store. To determine the answer to this question, I must consider the consequences of my action and the pleasure and pain that it will cause. Buying meat has the consequence of contributing to the suffering of animals, since these creatures must be slaughtered to become meat, whereas the alternative action of buying vegetables does not contribute to suffering, since vegetables do not feel pain. Furthermore, the act of buying meat produces more unhappiness over happiness, since animals are caused to suffer in the process of being raised and slaughtered, whereas the act of buying vegetables does not produce more unhappiness over happiness, since vegetables do not suffer when they are picked from the ground. Accordingly, a utilitarian would conclude that it would be immoral to buy meat, since that action supports suffering, and, therefore, one is morally required to buy vegetables instead. Utilitarianism is the view according to which the right action is the one that has the best consequences, all things considered, of the options open to you. Actions are valuable if they produce pleasure in the absence of pain, and bad if they cause pain and the deprivation of pleasure. These considerations we previously considered in the discussion section make utilitarianism plausible. But what are the arguments for this moral theory? Advocates of utilitarianism claim that it is the best moral theory because it delivers the most satisfactory answers to moral controversies. To see why this is the case, consider the following thought experiment. Suppose you were on a trolley hurling down some tracks. On the right side of the tracks, there are 5 people tied down. On the left side of the track, there is only 1 person tied down. If you do nothing, the trolley is going to drive onto the right side of the track, thereby killing the 5 people. However, you can save the 5 people on the right side of the track if you pull the switch next to you, which will divert the direction of the trolley onto the left side of the track to kill only 1 person. In this scenario, what would be the right thing to do? Should you do nothing and let the trolley kill the 5 people? Or, on the contrary, should you pull the switch next to you to divert the direction of the trolley to kill only 1 person? Morally speaking, it makes more sense to pull the switch on the trolley to kill the 1 person. After all, by pulling the switch to kill the 1 person, you will save the lives of 5 other people. Indeed, many people seem to agree with the moral judgment that pulling the switch to kill the 1 person in the trolley problem would be the right thing to do. In surveys on the trolley problem, for example, approximately 90% of respondents have chosen to kill the 1 to save the 5. Notice, however, that the moral judgment that pulling the switch to kill the 1 to save the 5 people in the trolley problem is consistent with utilitarianism. This is because killing the 1 to save the 5 is a better consequence than the alternative action of letting 5 people die. Furthermore, killing the 1 to save the 5 people will produce more happiness over unhappiness, since more people will live than die. Advocates of utilitarianism claim that this observation leads to the conclusion that utilitarianism does the best job at providing the most satisfactory answers to moral controversies. Not only does it provide the most satisfactory answers to moral controversies, but they will claim that it has an advantage over other moral theories, specifically Kant's deontological ethics. After all, under Kant's deontological ethics, the rightness of an action is determined by the nature of the act itself, independent of the consequences. This is why killing an innocent person, regardless of the circumstances or consequences, is always immoral. But a commitment to the immorality of killing innocent people, regardless of the circumstances or consequences, would lead to the seemingly absurd conclusion that you ought to let 5 people die in the trolley problem scenario. By contrast, since the rightness of an action under utilitarianism focuses on the best consequences and not simply on the nature of the act itself, it does not suffer from this difficulty. The second example that favors utilitarianism is the fact that it is malleable or not subject to the constraints of certain actions. For example, consider the following thought experiment. Suppose you are living in Germany during the Second World War and the Nazis knock on your door demanding information on the location of any Jewish people in your area. Furthermore, suppose that you have Jewish friends that you are hiding in your attic so that they will not be killed by the Nazis. In this scenario, what should you do? Should you tell the Nazis the truth by informing them that your Jewish friends are hiding in your attic? Or should you lie to the Nazis so that your Jewish friends will not be killed? Morally speaking, it seems that you should lie to the Nazis so your Jewish friends will not be killed. After all, this is a better consequence than the alternative action of letting your Jewish friends be killed. Furthermore, it will result in more happiness over unhappiness since your Jewish friends will live rather than die. Utilitarianism can explain why we have the moral intuition that you are morally required to lie, whereas deontology cannot explain this since it claims that lying is intrinsically wrong, independent of the beneficial consequences that it will provide. Utilitarianism is the view according to which the right action is the one that has the best consequences, all things considered, of the options open to you. Actions are valuable if they produce pleasure in the absence of pain, and bad if they cause pain in the deprivation of pleasure. There are three implications that utilitarianism has for everyday moral practice in society. One is, first, concerned with the nature of punishment. When someone breaks the law, we intentionally harm that offender or punish him for committing a wrongful act. However, what justifies intentionally harming or punishing this offender? According to David Boonin, two popular accounts have been put forward to justify the moral permissibility of punishment. The first is retributivism, which is the view that punishing an offender is morally justified whether or not it produces beneficial consequences. For example, imprisoning a popular celebrity for murder might produce social outrage among his admirers and, therefore, produce undesirable consequences for society, but will still be morally justified because he committed an immoral act. By contrast, the other popular account of punishment is the consequential solution, which claims that punishing an offender is justified if it will produce the best consequences. Since utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism, it falls into the category of being a consequentialist justification for the morality of punishment rather than a retributivist one. If we take a utilitarian point of view on the morality of punishment, it will yield different results than a retributive justification to the morality of punishment. For example, consider the death penalty. Suppose for the sake of argument that killing murderers on death row does not successfully deter crime, but that life imprisonment does deter crime. If that is right, then a utilitarian would have to morally oppose the death penalty in favor of a policy of life imprisonment, since the policy of life imprisonment produces the best consequences. By contrast, if you are a retributivist, you might think that the death penalty is morally justified even if it fails to produce the best consequences. For example, you might think that the death penalty is morally justified because a murderer deserves to be put to death for his immoral act. Consequently, taking a utilitarian perspective on the morality of punishment would involve giving preference to policies that aim more at rehabilitation for offenders rather than retribution. For instance, if politicians in the U.S. adopted the utilitarian moral theory, our prison system would look more like Norway's. I will not take the time to explain what Norway's prison system is like, but I will put a link to a video in the description which outlines these significant differences between the two. Secondly, accepting utilitarianism has implications for our treatment of animals. For example, each year worldwide, humans kill billions of land animals and almost 1 trillion marine animals so that humans can eat their flesh. For people living in developed countries like the United States, the eating of animals is not done for survival, but simply because people get gustatory pleasure from doing so. Furthermore, people can satisfy all their nutritional requirements by eating plant-based foods. Hence, if one is committed to the truth of utilitarianism, it seems that one ought to live a vegan lifestyle rather than a meat-eating one. This is because eating a diet with animal products contributes to worse consequences and more suffering than the alternative act of following a vegan lifestyle. After all, although some animals are killed in the process of producing plant-based foods, this is drastically lower than the number of animals that are killed in animal agriculture. This explains why Peter Singer, the most popular contemporary utilitarian living today, advocates following a vegan lifestyle. Finally, utilitarianism has implications for our moral obligations to the world's poorest. Many of us buy stuff that we do not need or that simply gives us pleasure. This results in the continued existence of a great deal of human suffering since we fail to direct our money to organizations that help alleviate the suffering of the world's poorest people. For example, when you go out to enjoy a movie with your friends, you are directing your money towards entertaining yourself rather than donating it to Oxfam, an organization that helps alleviate the suffering of the world's poorest people. Since donating your money to Oxfam would contribute to the best consequences and produce more happiness over unhappiness, utilitarianism morally requires us to donate our money to Oxfam instead of using our money to entertain ourselves. This, of course, makes utilitarianism a quite demanding moral theory, but ardent utilitarians will simply bite the bullet by accepting this implication. Utilitarianism is the view according to which the right action is the one that has the best consequences, all things considered, of the options open to you. Actions are valuable if they produce pleasure in the absence of pain, and bad if they cause pain and the deprivation of pleasure. There are many objections to utilitarianism. Here I will outline 5 of them. A key feature of utilitarianism rests on the value it assigns to happiness and unhappiness. Not only are these features valuable, but they are, according to Mill, the only things desirable as ends. But does a commitment to happiness and unhappiness as the only desirable ends lead to absurd conclusions? More narrowly, does it entail that we should only concern ourselves with satisfying frivolous desires just to get mere pleasure? If mere pleasure is the only desirable end, why not use harmful drugs or watch television all day? After all, these activities produce a great deal of pleasure. Indeed, if our goal in life was to satisfy mere pleasures alone, we would have lives that would be indistinguishable from animals. Advocates of this objection have therefore deemed utilitarianism as, quote, a doctrine worthy only of swine, end quote. Another objection to utilitarianism comes from Shelly Kagan's book, Normative Ethics, and it's called the Organ Harvest Objection. Here's the scenario. Imagine that there are 5 patients, each of whom will soon die unless they receive an appropriate transplanted organ. 1 needs a heart, 2 need kidneys, 1 needs a liver, and the 5th needs new lungs. Unfortunately, due to tissue incompatibilities, none of the 5 can act as a donor for the others. But here's Chuck, who is in the hospital for some fairly routine test. The hospital computer reveals that his tissue is completely compatible with the 5 patients. You are a surgeon, and it now occurs to you that you could chop up Chuck and use his organs to save the 5 others. What should you do? Intuitively, it seems morally wrong to kill Chuck in order to harvest his organs and save the 5 people. However, if we're utilitarians, we must say that not only is it permissible, but it's morally required that we kill Chuck and harvest his organs to save the 5 people. Because after all, that is a better consequence than the alternative action of letting the 5 people die. And so it seems that utilitarianism in this case delivers a repugnant conclusion, and that would provide grounds to reject it. Another objection to utilitarianism was put forward by Robert Nozick in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia. He calls it the experience machine, and it runs as follows. Here I'm quoting from Nozick's book. Suppose there was an experience machine that could give you any experience you desired. Super-duper neuropsychologists could stimulate your brain so that you would think and feel you were writing a great novel, or making a friend, or reading an interesting book. All the time, you'd be floating in a tank with electrodes attached to your brain. Should you plug into this machine for life, pre-programming your life experiences? Of course, while in the tank, you won't know that you're in there. You'll think that it's actually happening. Would you plug in? End quote. Intuitively, it seems that most of us would not plug into the experience machine, even though we would experience more pleasure in the experience machine than we would in the outside world. Robert Nozick suggests that this thought experiment demonstrates that pleasure is not the only thing desirable as an end, since we actually care about living in reality and participating in activities rather than the experience by itself. But if pleasure is not the only thing desirable as an end, this casts doubt on the truth of utilitarianism, since it is committed to the claim that pleasure is the only thing that is desirable as an end. Okay, here's a 4th objection to utilitarianism. This is again coming from Shelly Kagan's book, Normative Ethics. Imagine that some horrible crime has been committed, and unless the guilty party is found soon, an angry mob will riot in the streets, killing several innocent people. You are the sheriff, and you cannot figure out who actually committed the crime. But it occurs to you that you are in a position to secretly fabricate evidence, framing an innocent person, thereby satisfying the mob and saving the lives of those who would otherwise be killed during the riots. If we're utilitarians, it seems like we would be morally required to frame the innocent person in order to stop the bad consequence of the riots. But again, this seems like an unjust thing to do, and so utilitarianism can't account for that, which would again provide grounds to reject the theory in favor of something else. Okay, the last objection to utilitarianism that we're going to be looking at today is the special obligations objection. And this objection claims that utilitarianism ignores morally relevant factors or the special obligations that we have to our children, to our family, and to our friends that we simply don't have to strangers, and this would provide grounds to reject it. So here's a thought experiment to help bring this example out. Suppose that your child and a cancer research doctor are drowning and that you only have time to save one. If you save the cancer research doctor, he will go on to save many lives and therefore produce beneficial consequences for society. By contrast, if you save your child, he will not go on to save many lives and therefore not produce the same beneficial consequences for society as the cancer research doctor. Intuitively, it seems that you ought to save your child rather than the cancer research doctor, even though the continued existence of the cancer research doctor will produce the best consequences for society. However, if you were a utilitarian, you must believe that the morally right act to perform in this scenario would be to save the doctor. But this is morally repugnant. Utilitarianism, therefore, fails to take into account the special moral obligations that we have towards our children, our family, or our friends. In this video, I've explained what classical utilitarianism is. I've presented some arguments in defense of this moral theory, as well as some objections that have been raised against it. Hope you all enjoyed. Thank you for listening.